Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Your Legislators Season 19. I'm your host, Jonny Coker. We have a long legislative session ahead of us. For 60 days, New Mexico's elected officials will meet in Santa Fe to debate and to vote on laws aimed at solving issues facing our state. Joining me in studio to talk about all of this is District 37 Democratic Senator Bill Soules. Senator, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure, Jonny. I'm glad to be here.
It's great to have you in studio before you head out for the session. So essentially, you've been representing District 37 since 2013, but I wanted to ask a little bit about your background. You have a background as an educator. How has that informed your work as a senator for this past decade plus?
In many ways, that's why I ran to be in the Senate, is as an educator, I recognized that my high school students, they don't have a representative up there. They're not able to vote. The children in schools aren't able to vote. And education is one of the main parts of our budget. And yet lots of the decisions were being made by people who are not in education and don't have an education background. And so that's a lot of why I chose to run, is so that there is a strong voice for education and for children.
And with that in mind, what are your top priorities for this legislative session?
Well, obviously, being in education, it's to make sure and protect the education budget and education interests. New Mexico is not a poor state. We've got lots of money, yet we allow 50% of our kids to live at or near poverty. And so I'm going to be pushing to try and make sure that that extra money that New Mexico has is being spent for our future, which means investments in education, increasing the pay for teachers, increasing access and funds going towards early childhood education so kids get the best start in life. That's really going to be the long-term future for New Mexico.
And speaking of the state's budget, the recurring operating budget has, close to doubled since 2016, and the governor's proposing nearly an $11 billion budget this year. I wanted to ask, what are your thoughts on the budget that she's put forward, and do you have any takes on that?
I'm not on the budget committee. I've requested to be on there, but they still say they need me in the education area. I don't think that we're doing enough looking up and out to what New Mexico can be. We've got the money and the funds to make a real difference in a long-term future. And I think too much we're acting like we're afraid of the future. And what I mean by that is that we're putting the money in savings in Wall Street and other places for when the money's not there, rather than making long-term investments to a different future. And so I'd like to see larger investments in children, in research at our universities, so that when the extractive industries of oil and gas go away, that we're not just reliant on our savings, but we've actually set up a different mechanism for funding the state.
And you mentioned the oil and gas industry, so I want to ask about that a little bit. One of the things you've spoken about in the past is diversifying New Mexico's economy away from the oil and gas industry. How do you balance the push for renewable energy and other resources while oil and gas still is such a big money maker for the state? Like, how do you balance those things as a legislator?
I don't think it's really a balancing proposition. What we need to do is use the money from oil and gas to rapidly move towards renewables and use that money to make that change and transition. We know it's coming, we know it's needed for the environment, and we should be using that money. And that's what I meant by making an investment in the future. Invest that money now so that it's paying off in the future when oil and gas starts to decline.
And again, staying with oil and gas, I was looking at some of the legislation that you've pre-filed. You have a bill amending the Pipeline Safety Act that would enhance civil penalties for violations of that act. It seems fairly straightforward, but tell me about your reasoning for filing that bill.
I've been working with the PRC, and most of that, though it sounds like really holding people's feet to the fire, What it really does is it just makes sure that New Mexico's penalties match federal penalties, so that people aren't playing as to which court you go into is going to have greater or lesser penalties. It just makes those match with the federal law.
Do you see any backlash to that bill, or do you foresee any backlash? Because I know sometimes that any bills to do with oil and gas that are seen as unfriendly to that industry can have some backlash. So are you expecting anything like that?
I don't expect backlash, and partly backlash typically is like a political backlash. I live in a very progressive district. Las Cruces is relatively progressive. I don't face any of that as far as my political career, if you will, or whether I get reelected. There certainly will be some pushback from the oil and gas industry if they see this as a bill that increases regulation or penalties. I don't think this bill really does that. It just aligns the New Mexico law with federal law.
I see. So sticking with pre-filed education or pre-filed legislation, I want to go back to talking about education with some of those bills that you've pre-filed. Tell me about the bill that would replace the existing Public Education Commission with a newly established state school board. I know that seems pretty significant. It would change the governance of public education in the state. So just give me a rundown of what this bill does.
And let me give you a little background. We used to have a state superintendent of schools and a publicly elected school board. That changed under Richardson when Richardson was governor and he wanted more control of the schools. And it very narrowly passed to change the Constitution to have a Secretary of Education. The first one or two were okay, but now it seems like every time we have a new governor, the change in education policy comes in as to who's Secretary of Education. And even under this governor, we have had 5 or 6, I'm losing count now, as to how many Secretaries of Education, because as soon as you get an educator in there who wants to make education policy, but it differs with what the governor wants something to be, the governor pulls them out, we get a new secretary. That's not good for education. Education needs long-term stability to make significant results. When we had a state superintendent in the past, those superintendents lasted for 10, 15 years and provided stability for education. Right now, the whiplash that education feels from the changing secretaries, whether it's because of a change in administration or the governor changing the secretary position, is holding back education in New Mexico. And I think it's one of the reasons that we lag behind lots of the rest of the country, is we don't have aligned long-term stability. Doing it now will affect the next governor. It will not affect this governor in any way, shape, or form based on just the numbers. And so this is not a poke on this particular governor. It's been something I've proposed several times in the past. I think it's what we need to have good governance for education.
And New Mexico consistently does rank pretty low in terms of educational rankings and standardized test scores, things like that. What more does New Mexico need to do? You mentioned that stability that bill would bring, but what more does New Mexico to do in order to step it up in the realm of education from your perspective?
I think we're doing lots of the things we need to. I regularly tell people that investments in education are sort of like buying savings bonds. You don't make a change, make an investment in the future, and expect to get full value of it next year. You have to wait for that to roll through the system of education. The changes we made in the teaching of reading, where we now follow the science of teaching of reading, we are already seeing gains. One of the other bills that I'm carrying this year, it's not pre-filed, it'll be voted probably for LESC endorsement on Monday before session starts, but is a bill to improve how we teach math so that we are teaching the science of math to raise those scores. Most of the low score performance is based on our low reading and math achievement. And so we're making those changes in New Mexico. We're making the changes in how teachers are prepared, particularly in the teaching of reading and math. The other thing that we need to do is we need to do a better job for our youngest children so that they don't come to school traumatized by the negative aspects of poverty. And so trying to get more children into prenatal care, parents into prenatal care. getting the children when they're born with home visiting going so that they are getting the best start in life, so that parents have all the resources they need for the child to have a good start. Dealing with poverty in our communities. So much of why we are 50th in education has little to do with education. It has more to do with the health of our communities and with the amount of poverty that we've got in New Mexico. And we've got to see those as tied together, not just as an education issue.
And moving on from that, from education, talking about those broader issues that are tied in, of course you sit on the Senate Conservation Committee. What discussions are happening to address resource challenges when it comes to water rights, when it comes to saving New Mexico's climate from climate change that's happening right now that could be affecting New Mexicans?
New Mexico there are lots of ironies in New Mexico in that we are the second largest producer of oil and gas, which is one of the largest, or is the largest contributor to climate change problems. And at the same time, we are one of the larger producers of the renewable energy in wind and in solar, and have the largest resources in that area. And so there's some ironies going on all the way as to how do we deal with and manage all of those. Water certainly is a critical piece, and in New Mexico, our water laws are complex at best, with who has senior rights, and we've been in a long-term drought. Just the Rio Grande, for instance, the things we get through some of the committee hearings, the water from the Rio Grande is allocated at about 200% of the actual water. And you learn interesting terms when you're up there. They talk about wet water and paper water, as far as how much there is. Wet water is like real water flowing down the river. Paper water is how much water you get if there were enough. And so it's very, very complex. I'm glad we've got people who are working on lots of those issues. I think it's important that we really start working on moving away from burning fossil fuels for our energy resources and towards renewables, and make that transition rapidly, not wait until it's a crisis when it's going to be more expensive.
And something you've pushed for in the past that is related to this is public transportation, and specifically high-speed rail. I'm wondering, has there been any development in that area? Has there been any push within the legislature to see some high-speed rail in New Mexico? Because it seems like a far-off idea right now, but is it something that we could potentially see materialize in the near future?
I love that you bring that up. It's one of the things I get probably more calls on in both directions. Some people call me crazy, like, we don't need high-speed rail in New Mexico and all of this. And others like, oh my gosh, that's visionary, we should do that. High-speed rail, and what I would envision is from Chihuahua all the way up to Denver and maybe up to the Canadian border. The rest of the world is putting in more high-speed rail. No one is taking it out. And there are a couple of projects in the United States. I think there's one down in the Atlanta area that may be almost ready to come online, one in Texas ready to come online. The California one is mired in overruns. The problem is if we wait to make the investment when there's enough infrastructure to do all of it, then it's going to cost too much. And right now, being able to get the right-of-ways and other kinds of things before it gets built up, it's more available. The economic difference that would happen in the next 20 years along a high-speed rail that ran through the valley all the way up into Colorado would be huge. I've put out there, just because you have to attach a money to it, to put $1 billion, and people go, oh, you're crazy. A couple of years ago, we had $4 billion of new money unallocated. We could do it if we chose. Instead, we put that money in the bank in Wall Street for some time in the future. But 20 years from now, it's not going to be $1 billion. It's going to be $4 billion. This year, I've pre-filed a bill again, not to put in the cost, but the companion bill I've always put in, and I think it's for $250,000, but to do an economic impact study of what would it cost and what would the economic impact be over the next several years. Economists like Dr. Peach from New Mexico State University, who's a retired economist extraordinaire, I shall say. I think he's wonderful. But he's done some rough calculations and has been my expert witness when I presented the bill. He's like, oh, it would be economically game-changing for New Mexico to do so. Yeah. And so it's just one of those where I'm trying to look up and out to what New Mexico could be 20 years from now. But I get more calls like, go, positive, that's great, to, Souls has lost his marbles. He wants $1 billion for his pet project of this crazy train. So.
Right. And with that pre-filed legislation that would, look at the idea of this, how much, within the legislature, how much support for this do you think there is? Like, you say it's polarizing. Like, do you think there's enough support for this to start being pushed through a little bit, or is it hard to predict?
To get a study done, I think it's reasonable to do. To actually put $1 billion right now, we don't have a lot of people that are looking up and out to those kinds of big ideas that I think we ought to. And particularly because we've got money now, we can look at big ideas to do. I'm hopeful that we get a study. And if the study comes back that it costs too much for any of the economic gain into the future or things like that, fine. I'll have at least got people to think about it.
For sure. And, moving on now, because we could probably talk about this all day, because it is an interesting prospect for sure, but I did want to move on to some other issues, including healthcare in New Mexico. I noticed that you did have some legislation pre-filed related to healthcare that would amend the Professional Psychologists Act that expands the definition of, quote, independently licensed prescribing clinician to include psychologists with at least 4 years of independent experience in prescribing psychotropic medications. So what was your thought process behind getting behind this bill, and what would it do for New Mexicans?
A little bit of background is New Mexico was the first state to allow prescribing psychologists. Normally, anyone to be able to prescribe psychotropic drugs would be a psychiatrist, which went to a full medical school. But many years ago, New Mexico, very forward-looking, recognized that there was a huge shortage of psychiatrists, and that with extra training, PhD-level psychologists with extensive extra training are in New Mexico allowed to prescribe in a very narrow range psychotropic drugs. Couple of those psychologists came to me, and the problems were that they always had to be under direct supervision of people who there is a shortage of. And so they were asking to be able to supervise their own after they've had 5 years within the field of doing this. We passed that law a couple of years ago. This is where there needs to be we figured out there's a couple of places we need some additions and some changes to it. And so New Mexico, out in what are called our frontier areas away from Las Cruces, Albuquerque, Santa Fe, there are essentially almost no behavioral health care available for people. And this greatly increases the access for people when we can have prescribing psychologists. And all of the data indicates the outcomes for prescribing psychologists are exactly the same as with psychiatrists.
Mm. And the state is facing a healthcare worker shortage in general. How much talk in the Roundhouse is there of fixing this healthcare worker shortage, and what kind of push do you think we'll see this session to address those healthcare concerns for New Mexicans?
We do. We have a shortage of physicians. There's a shortage of physicians almost everywhere in the country, with the exception of a couple of places where they cluster because of things like MD Anderson or I'm trying to remember the one over in Phoenix. There are a couple of the large health center types of areas.
Okay.
And so New Mexico is not unique in having a shortage of healthcare. There are a number of things that we should fix in the area. Some of it is expand the number of doctors that we're preparing. So expand the number that come out of UNM. That means expand the number going in. Burrell College has been a big help. There's a shortage of residencies in New Mexico, and therefore our doctors go elsewhere for the residencies, and some put down roots and families and don't come back. And so trying to increase all of those access types of points. We hear lots about the high cost of malpractice insurance. Again, we're not a poor state. We've got enough money. We could, if we choose, pay for the malpractice for physicians that don't have legitimate claims against them, that are good doctors, to make it more affordable for them to work here. There's a number of small things, all that'll make a difference. And I think we're going to see a number of different bills. It's not my specific area of expertise. I don't serve on the health committee, but certainly it's an area I keep watching because we need them here in Las Cruces, and we're much better off than Silver City or Lordsburg or places that are further out from the population bases.
And Senator, moving on to another topic, obviously there are a lot of really important topics to voters, but something in my own reporting that people ask about consistently is public safety, and of course bail reform and the state's competency laws are a hot topic. Do you think this year's legislature will walk away this year having made some major changes to those laws? Because in the past couple of years things have fell short. The special session ultimately didn't really bring out much in terms of change in this regard. So do you feel confident that the legislature is going to walk away making some compromises and making some changes to these laws?
I do. I think the special session was rushed and we went into that without a bill ready to go. You can't have an open-ended special session where you're going to go up there and hash out for 2 weeks how to fix everything. The Judiciary Interim Committee has been working on all of these. I just talked with our floor leader yesterday, and they are working on putting together an omnibus crimes bill, if you will, that'll incorporate several of the different kinds of pieces. I know Senator Cervantes has been working on it. They've been working with the governor's office and trying to make some compromises as to which pieces make sense, which pieces are constitutionally legal, which ones have an effect and which ones are just window dressing and make people feel better without actually making them safer. And so I think that'll be one of the big pushes, particularly in the first 30 days of the session. I know the plan on the Senate side is to try and get something to the governor's desk within the first 30 days, but it's a legislative session. Anybody who makes predictions will be wrong. So we'll see what happens.
Definitely. And speaking of that, speaking of legislative collaboration and being able to work with other legislators and getting a bill to the governor's desk in a certain amount of time, especially when it comes to something as important as public safety. In this polarized political climate, how are you approaching to working across the aisle with other legislators? Like, do you feel like national politics has seeped into the state's legislature, or do you still feel like there's a decent amount of bipartisan work happening?
That's a difficult question to answer before I get up there for this session. The personality of the Senate is going to change a lot. By my count, I think there are 17 or 18 new senators or new to the Senate out of 42s. More than a third will be new to the Senate. Several are coming over from the House, so they've got some legislative experience. Several are brand new to government and politics. Many of the legislators on the Republican side that I've worked with in the past chose to retire after this last session, and I don't know many of the new ones coming in. There are still some wonderful people. Pat Woods, senator from up in the northeast part of the state that I worked with on several bills, and is a fine gentleman. And I'm hoping to be able to work with a number of them. In this area, Senator Crystal Diamond Brantley, very strong credentials on early childhood, lots of the young children, family type of things that I'm hoping to be able to work with her. And there are a whole lot, I just don't know their personalities. And there's going to be, I think, on the Senate side, we've got 6 or 7 new people coming on to the Democrats on the Senate side. And so
it's hard to say.
It's hard to say. It will be different. The personality of the chambers will change. The Senate probably more so than the House.
And for my final question, I just wanted to ask, how are you going to measure how successful this legislative session is? Like, by the end of it, in the end of March, like when you're walking out of the roundhouse, how will you feel Like, what will a success look like, or how do you measure that success?
The reason I chuckle a little bit is by the end of the session, I forget some of the successes early on in the session. And usually on my drive home, I'm like, what the heck am I doing? Why am I doing this? I'm angry, I'm mad, I don't want to talk to anybody. It fades because I think we often leave a lot on the table of things that we could have, should have gotten done. Some of it for good reason that they weren't ready. Some of it there's politics where things got bottled up and know that time kills most bills. And I have to think back about the things that we did get done. Lots of my colleagues and others often count the success by how many bills they passed. As a chair of the Education Committee, there's sometimes the biggest successes are making sure some legislation doesn't get passed. And those don't often show up because that success is somebody else's loss. And that's part of what politics is about, is I always try and look as a whole, did we make the state better for people? And in my particular case, did we make the state better for children, for schools, for parents, for families? Is it a better place in New Mexico as a result of what we did?
Well, Senator Soules, unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you so much for coming in studio to talk about this session. It's been a pleasure, and we hope to have you back sometime soon.
Well, anytime, Johnny, and I love being here and appreciate the questions, and you ask very good, in-depth questions. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Well, that's all for today's episode. Coverage of New Mexico's legislative session will continue next week. In the meantime, you can stay up to date on the latest local news at krwg.org. For KRWG Public Media, I'm Jonny Coker, and we'll see you next time on Your Legislators.